Okay, we can continue, please.
Okay.
Our goal today is just to help make sure that our board members can feel confident in participating in board meetings. So we're hoping that with some of the information that you'll hear, it'll help you as you sit in board meetings and think, which hat am I wearing? Am I wearing my corporate hat? Am I wearing the NIOP board member hat? And what does that look like? What are those differences? So you'll hear some of that today and hopefully help you feel more confident in participating going forward. Mr. President, I believe this is yours.
Folks, this isn't any different than what we talked about at the last meeting. Just with your due diligence, be prepared for meetings, review materials in advance, be engaged when you're in the room. You have a voice, to encourage you to use it. Expectations for the board members is participate in committees, if not being a committee chair, and again, contribute. This isn't my organization. This is our organization to help guide, direct, and go forward. So those are my expectations, and the expectations we have of being board members is coming from the executive team as well. So thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
So who's excited to talk fiduciary responsibilities and corporate responsibility? Yeah, enthusiastic show of hands. It's one of my favorite things. I'll try to make it as brief and painless as possible, but there are some important considerations. I know a lot of you, this isn't the only board that you've served on, or this isn't the first board that you've served on, but it's just good to have a reminder from time to time that there are, the NIOP is a
and the mid fraction.
Okay. It might be helpful, obviously, if you have questions, I want you to ask them, but if there's some background noise going on, it'd be helpful to put on mute. But one of the important things to remember, even though it's an unpaid position, serving as a director of NIOP is organized as a not-for-profit corporation. It's we have to follow Illinois corporate law with respect to that, and even though it is an unpaid position, in extremely rare circumstances you do have legal exposure, and so what I want to talk about is how do you protect yourself while serving in this role. So in going through some of the fiduciary duties, probably the primary one is the duty of care, and a lot of this goes just into being diligent at board meetings and understanding where the organization is going, where you can run into issues from a legal standpoint, and I'll talk about insurance and everything along those lines, but where you can run into legal issues is if you have kind of if you fail to exercise reasonable oversight over an organization, and it runs into issues. So I mean, a lot of this is aligns with what Brian said, making sure that you're showing up prepared to board meetings, that you've read materials in advance, that you participate in the board meetings, and in terms of where directors have gotten in trouble or run into liability issues, it's never a case over making a wrong decision. So there's no legal liability for making a wrong decision. There is legal liability for not exercising good judgment or going through a proper procedures when exercising your role as a director. So one of the primary requirements for the duty of care is making sure that you protect the association's assets. It's not a large organization, but it's also not a small one. So one of your roles is to make sure that the organization is run financially to where it can continue. Now, in carrying out this role, it's you aren't on an island. You do have, NIOP has general counsel. That's me and my firm, and we also bring in other experts. Beyond me and Lee, we have the accountants, we have investment advisors. So it's perfectly acceptable to kind of farm out some of the management matters. The other primary fiduciary duty for a board director is to exercise the duty of loyalty. This means placing the interests of the corporation, in this case NIOP, over any type of personal interest. One of the big ways that you can run afoul of this is by having a conflict of interest that's not disclosed. So from time to time, NIOP enters into contracts with vendors. It's expected that, and I don't think anybody on here owns a hotel or an event space, but it is, there are issues. I give an example, and I guess an organization that has some controversy and gets some attention, but the National Rifle Association, they're under a lot of audit issues, and it's something like over a third of the board members also have contracts to provide services to the NRA and make a decent amount of money. So that's where that's an example of something. We don't have that here unless there's a secret hotel going on, but as if NIOP's activities change, there may be a need to hire consultants with expertise in the industry. Any type of conflict of interest has to be disclosed at a minimum. That's not to say that NIOP couldn't enter into business with one of its directors, but it has to be an open and transparent process. The final fiduciary duty is the duty of obedience to purpose, and this basically means being aligned with the goals of NIOP, which is to advance the oilseed industry. This one is pretty wishy-washy in terms of how you comply with it and how you enforce it. But I think one of the main things, and we understand everybody that's sitting on the board is a member or works for a company. They're going to have the viewpoints of their company. We aren't asking anybody to ignore what they've learned or what they're bringing to the table. But the important thing to remember is any decision that you're making in your capacity as a board member is with the intent of furthering NIOP, not just your company. A few, I mean, I've covered a lot of this, but I think one thing that's important, and this goes to the duty of care and protecting the NIOP's assets. One of the main things that we need to make sure that NIOP does is to preserve its tax exempt status. So this means making sure that it's achieving kind of its educational and kind of betterment of the industry purpose, that it's not turning into an issue or something where the organization is generating money for members. I'm not right now. There's nothing that comes anywhere close to that, but that's important to consider. The other thing, and I'll discuss this more in more detail, is making sure we don't run afoul of any antitrust laws.
Hey, John,
Yes.
before you leave that, I always like to throw in about the tax exempt status. Some people are misguided because of that name, that the organization can't make a surplus. And I just encourage you to know that it's actually very smart business for an association to have some level of surplus so that you can weather storms like what we have seen and we have been through in the last few years with pandemic. So just that nonprofit word, sometimes when people see a bottom line that has a surplus on it, I've had questions about that in the past. So I just want to make sure that we're aware that it is acceptable and legal and even prudent that we have some level of reserves. And that comes from years where you do have surpluses versus years where we obviously have either a break-even situation or, as in the case of pandemic, we've had losses. So just wanted to throw that in because that's sometimes a question.
Very good point. Very good point. So where issues where, and like I said, we have insurance, so I don't want anybody to, especially new members, to think, what the heck did I sign up for here? But you know, in terms of there are areas where NIOP or the NIOP's directors do have legal exposure for actions that are taken by NIOP. And the principle behind it is, if somebody is a plaintiff or somebody's been wronged in some way, you know, the courts prioritize providing relief to them. If the resources of NIOP are exhausted, they can go after the directors. Probably the biggest case where this comes up is usually involved with payroll or payroll taxes, which that's not an issue here. NIOP does not have any employees, but there are instances, you know, we've dealt with some organizations where I think they they went a while without counsel and interpreted their nonprofit status and tax exempt status to mean that they were also tax exempt from state property taxes, and things got very, very hairy for a couple years there, and that was actually a consideration that the directors might have to be on the hook to pay these back taxes. We avoided that situation, but that's something that can come up. In terms of other areas where board members have been held liable for actions of the board, is cases involving defamation. So if they're, you know, if NIOP really changed its purpose and started going after particular companies or particular individuals, that is areas of exposure. Any type of breach of contract. So, you know, we do enter into a ton of contracts. Some of these are pretty high value in terms of the hotels and things like that. And so that is an instance if the director's found to not be exercising their fiduciary duties, where there can be exposure there. but always put an asterisk on that. We do have insurance. One of the ways that you can protect yourself and demonstrate that you were that you're meeting your fiduciary responsibilities is to make sure that any decision, the process for making a decision is thorough and really commensurate with the decision that's at hand. And so what that's called, or what the courts use, is the business judgment rule. So that's why I talked about you're not really required to reach the right decision when contemplating a decision, but you are required to thoroughly contemplate a particular decision and act in good faith. And that serves as a protection for liability. So I've been teasing insurance or talking about insurance and want to make folks aware. NIOP does indemnify its directors and its officers. There are limitations to this. If you're at a reception and punch somebody in the face, that's not going to be covered, because that's not really you acting in your role as a director. But in terms of liability that could arise from making a decision as a director, NIOP does provide for indemnification. We also have director and officer insurance that can cover some gaps between indemnification. But it's just important to remember intentional conduct. So something that's personal conduct, or something that's very apparently wrong, that's not going to be covered. So I think Lee was going to cover or discuss a couple of the.
I have a quick question, John.
Yeah.
Back on the liability slide that you were just on, I think we talked about it a little bit last week, that you've been a part of some organizations that, they have the open bar, and we kind of talked about kind of how that can go sideways in a hurry. Where is the liability at if we have a reception and somebody is overserved and something happens as a result of that? What's the liability on the board as far as that goes?
I mean, in terms of your personal liability, I think it would really depend on the circumstances. I think it would be very challenging for somebody to go after a director's personal assets. But with that said, NIOP does have some exposure there. Also, the event space that's hosting it. So there is, they're called DRAM laws, and it's basically, bars, restaurants, anywhere that serves alcohol does have a responsibility to make sure that people aren't overserved, and if they are, that they deal with them appropriately. And so, I mean, I know we had a situation arise at the last annual convention, and in that particular case, the hotel stepped in and asked an individual to leave. It's not a situation where NIOP doesn't have any exposure. We do, as part of the hotel agreements, we do have to maintain insurance, but it is something to consider as kind of you plan these types of events. It's alcohol's there, and a lot of people like that. It's just being smart about that. And the example I give, I was a pretty new attorney working with a trade association, and they had a conference out in Palm Springs, and they had all these different receptions held in the same place, but they were kind of geared towards different folks, but they had nothing, so like a new member, then a sponsor, then a director, and then the main reception, but they had no controls over who was going into it. So if you stacked it up, it was about 6.5 hours straight of open bar. And that's too much open bar. There were not a lot, but there were multiple issues that had to be addressed. And it wasn't something I'd want to repeat. But there is exposure there, but we do try and protect ourselves through insurance. The hotel bears some responsibility, but the thing is if you're a plaintiff's attorney and you're representing somebody that, say, they were assaulted or had something bad happen at a reception, you aren't going to sit down and say, well, I'm going to sue this person, but not anybody else. You're going to sue everyone and kind of let the courts settle it out. So if there was an incident at an NIOP event that rose to that level, NIOP would have some exposure.
And I can add to that, and I know John's mentioned it several times, that the hotel has some responsibility, but generally I sign contracts and I sign the BEOs, which I would imagine is a type of contract that says that the hotel can limit guests and that they will limit guests that, in their opinion, look to have had too much drink. So they are equally as concerned as we are. And we also try to have food when there's also alcohol, and that doesn't always happen. Sometimes we have a beer break or something that doesn't make that work, but we try to be cognizant of keeping some food in there as well. So just, we are aware, but always good for everybody to be aware. Okay, so moving on, again, a lot of this we have talked about, for example, the tax exempt status. I wanted to make sure that you guys were aware of that. We are a 501c6, which means that we are not a charitable organization. So when it comes to deductibility, our expenses for our association are deductible as far as a business expense. We also sometimes get the question, and it is written on your dues notices, that we do not do any lobbying. So if we did, we would have to notify our members as to which portion of their dues could not be deducted, but that is not something that comes into play for NIOP. But you may see that on our renewal notices, and every once in a while, I'll get a question from someone's accounting department. So just for your sake of board member to know that information. We do have a few board meetings a year. We try to schedule those in advance so that you can plan and participate. I will tell you that our bylaws do address, I'll try to find that really quick. It's under section 3, article 4, and it just says that if a director shall fail to attend 2 out of 3 consecutive board meetings without sending a communication to the president or secretary stating the reason for any such absence, or if the reason provided for that absence is unacceptable, the board of directors seat may be declared vacant and by action of the board. So we do have somewhat of a attendance policy in that regard. At the same time, we also recognize that your paying job comes first. So just be aware of that we do keep records, obviously. And to date, at this point, I don't think we have any concerns, but we have crossed that bridge before, and we do have to have conversations with board members about continuing on. We also understand that your job may change and your responsibilities may change. And if that's the case, hopefully you would bring that to us rather than get into a situation where you're just not attending. But we do understand that. So it's not always necessarily a negative on your part. It could just be a changing business situation or personal situation. So just to be aware. We do try to send the board meeting materials in advance. So we do ask that you read through it. I would love to have you point out questions or things that you see that maybe are incomplete or you want more information prior to the board meeting. I would love to hear that prior to the board meeting so that you can be better prepared. We can be better prepared to really take action. So we do encourage you to read it when it comes to you. That's usually in advance of meetings. We do send the minutes out after meetings. I try to do that as quickly as possible after meetings so that when you're reading it, hopefully your recollection will be clearer. And if I've missed something or if there's something there that's not represented in the manner that you think it should be, you would bring that to our attention sooner than later so that we have a chance to reconcile that. What else? Any questions of me on this information so far? If not, John, I think we're good to keep moving.
Next thing I'll discuss is antitrust. This is a big consideration for trade associations because trade associations exist to get competitors to come sit around the table together to gather. If it's done for the right purposes and the right way, it's advancing the industry. Everyone benefits. If it's done the wrong way or gives off the appearance of the wrong way, there can be significant consequences. So in the food industry right now, there are a ton of lawsuits, in particular dealing with the protein sectors, so beef, poultry, pork, turkey, and a lot of the allegations and the complaints center around trade associations or trade association activities. So that is something that we take very seriously. So kind of, there are several federal antitrust laws on the books. There's also generally states have their own laws that mimic the federal laws, but some of the activities that are prohibited are price fixing. So this means, sitting down together with competitors and saying, hey, this is the price that we're going to sell this at. And everybody's kind of in agreement on that. We'll let's set our price at this. I think we'll all make money. That is illegal. Any type of market allocation, any other type of activity that has the effect of kind of colluding with others to impact the market or make products more expensive is going to be unlawful. So any type of market allocation, like, hey, I'll cover this port, you cover that port. We won't try to fight each other over this business. It's perfectly reasonable to make your own individual business decision on what makes sense and how to deal with competition. But where it becomes illegal is if there's any type of an agreement to not compete with each other. Also, another issue that can be anti-competitive is blackballing. So this could be squeezing, refusing to do business with competitors, refusing to do business with suppliers or buyers, any type of, once again, that's a decision that's perfectly reasonable for your own company. But where it becomes illegal is if there is an agreement amongst competitors to make any type of action along this line that amounts to blackballing. And there may be some exceptions for that if it's someone that's a bad actor in the market, but it's something you want to tread on very carefully. In terms of potential penalties for antitrust, number one, prison. It's very rare, but it does happen. I always say a great, interesting movie to watch is The Informant. It dealt with, it kind of follows, it's depicts an employee at one of NIOP's member companies that got involved in price fixing with lysine. And it takes what seems like a pretty mundane topic and makes it pretty interesting. So in rare circumstances, it can lead to incarceration. And just to be clear, NIOP's insurance does not protect against incarceration. You know, companies can be required to disgorge, you know, what they gain from anti-competitive behavior, and there is also, in some certain circumstances, treble damages. So basically, 3 times what you made off of anti-competitive behavior can be turned over. So in terms of best practices, you know, we, number one, in our board meetings and in all of our meetings, we provide the antitrust statement and make sure that acknowledgement is in the minutes. But, you know, and generally I review the minutes and the agenda before we have a meeting. But I can't be everywhere. Lee can't be everywhere. There are all kinds of side conversations and speed dating that goes on at the conference, and so the onus is on the actual members to make sure that they're staying above board in terms of their discussions. So, you know, when you're at meetings, when you're in social events, making sure that discussions are not anti-competitive. So, you know, one of the items that can tread on being anti-competitive or providing an opportunity for collusion is discussing confidential business information. So if you're a buyer, talking with another buyer, talking about quotes that you're getting from a supplier, or vice versa if you're a seller, talking about any type of, you know, non-public business plans or agreements to blackball competitors, or basically any type of concerted action that's going to have an impact on the market that doesn't benefit consumers can be in the antitrust territory. So are there any questions? I think Lee's picking it up from here, but are there any questions about the antitrust? All right, well, we'll go on to the next section.
So very quickly, this is probably kind of obvious to us, but just to know that, you know, it's our chairman's job to run the meetings. We have had instances where the chairman is not there. We call him the president. So that's when we will move to the next vice president and so on and so forth. So we have recently, with another group, had an instance where we were trying to conduct a meeting by Zoom. Some were in person, some were not. In that instance, we ended up having the ranking officer, if you will, that was in person to run the meeting. So it hasn't crossed our bridge yet, but our chairman is obviously in that role. Robert's rules is something we've talked about as a board before. Some of us have had some training in it. Some of us have a book on our shelf and hope that through osmosis we'll understand it and know it. We try simply to go by the simple parts of Robert's rules, or the pretty basic. We're not always on track with that. Like even today, for example, when a motion comes from a committee, it doesn't typically need a second, but we are in practice of that. So what that second usually means, it doesn't mean you have to agree with what the motion is. It means you agree that it should be discussed. So in the future, as we look at having conversations, typically you put the motion on the floor and the second, and then you discuss it. We typically don't do it that way. We usually have some discussion and then try to formulate what it feels like is what our general agreement is. I will note that for the minutes, we typically do not, this is how I was trained, do not write in the minutes who made the motion and who seconded it, even though sometimes you will have presidents who, because of their training, they'll repeat that kind of thing. And that's just the way I was trained as a protection measure so that it never comes back that, Joe made a motion against Sam and therefore that's why he made that motion so that it could look like it's punitive and personal. So I don't typically do that. However, it is important if you do not agree with the motion and you vote against it, I usually will ask, but if I don't ask, please know that if you want it to be noted in the minutes that you voted against the motion, even though the motion may be carried, I do capture those notes. I'll give you an instance. I had a board member one time that felt that the motion that was passed would be very negatively received by his leadership at his company should they learn that the organization made a decision to do X. And so he wanted it stated in the minutes that he voted against it should his leadership ever come back on that. So just kind of a FYI for you. You always hear us talk about quorum. Establishing a quorum is kind of why I chase you guys sometimes and try to make sure that we have as many people in attendance as possible. The bylaws outline for us what the quorum looks like when it comes to member meetings versus what a board meeting quorum looks like. Same way with votes, the bylaws typically outline that for us. So I think right here before I forget, recently the executive committee had a planning meeting and it was suggested that we create a place for documents for you, the board of directors, to be able to reach out to the bylaws as an example and be able to get it. So on the website, I've created under the board of directors tab, I've created a separate tab that's called board of directors resources. You'll be sent a password. Everybody will have the same password, but I'll send you a password for that. It'll have things behind it like the bylaws, like the list of committees that we are trying to keep up in an Excel format and other documents as we come upon them and that we find or you suggest should be available. We'll put that there so that you have access to that. Okay. And probably even in the future, put board meeting notes and maybe even the board meeting agendas and certainly the minutes there. So it should become a resource for us. But if you have suggestions on what documents you might need or want quicker access to, and then I can put those online for you, then that's what we'll do. So will you advance it to the next slide, please? It was mentioned earlier that NIOP does not have any employees, so you don't have that responsibility. That's kind of the beauty of having an agreement with a management company like ours is you don't have to pay those taxes. That's my job. And so in case that was questioned earlier, I was wondering if anybody picked up on that maybe didn't realize that we actually aren't technically employees of NIOP. However, I will tell you that Scott and I and anyone else who helps us out at different meetings certainly understands that every single NIOP member is one of our bosses. So just so that you know that, we do have a contract. You might want to go to the next slide. I'm not sure it talks a whole lot about it, but we do have a contract with the NIOP, and each year you as a board of directors in some way, shape or form kind of look at updating that. Usually that comes through the executive committee, but that contract is a fee that's then divided over 12 months. And included in that fee are things like overhead and our expenses. Now we also, and some of you who've been treasurer will know, we do bill for things like copies, and there are certain softwares that are specifically used for NIOP. So you will pay either that software fee or some portion of that's prorated, and that is in a separate bill. So it's not a part of the management fee. It's in a separate bill, and it is outlined as copies or whatever it is, telephone, storage. So if you ever had any question about that, I think that is a little bit of a step up in level of detail that the board was looking for and that we always have done. So that's how we are paid, in case that's of interest to any of you. You are welcome to that at any time. I will tell you the management document's probably about 4 or 5 years old. And then you would have to use the minutes to see where we've updated as far as compensation. So that compensation has changed. Sometimes that changes due to cost of living. Sometimes that changes due to changes in scope of work. So right now, the management fee that's there is based on a scope of work that was outlined at the beginning of the year, which we believe would happen. So for example, if you guys were to decide you want a second convention, you want one in the spring, you want one in the fall, that would be outside, that fall one would be outside the scope. And you would, if that was an interest, you would ask us, hopefully, to bid on that and then say, how much would it take to get that done? And then we would have an addendum to the contract. So that's how that's paid. We don't kind of nitpick that to death, but we do look for, the one time NIOP has used it was when we had to unwind the 2020 conference, and we had all of those details done and all that money in the bank, and yet we had to figure out how to either return it or either capture it so that it goes forward for several years. So that was outside the scope, and the NIOP board did engage us for additional compensation to do that additional duty. So just kind of FYI, if I can ever answer questions about that, I'm happy to. Usually the treasurers are pretty tuned into what that looks like and how that is calculated, and certainly the executive committee. So anything else on this? I think we're down to questions now. Yep, questions, comments?
I would just like to say that I've been on other boards and we've never gone through this thorough of an orientation. I think this was very productive and worthwhile. So thank you, Lee and John and Brian. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Lee, it's Craig here. I did have one question. I guess over the last couple of years, we've all recognized just how fragile some organizations can be. So I wanted to get a little bit of an idea from an Associations Plus perspective, from a succession planning perspective. You know, you're a small company. I've always just dealt with you. If you were to come down with COVID or something different, I just kind of wondering what the succession plan is from perspective.
I'll be glad to answer that, Craig. I think we've actually had a little bit of a conversation about that in the past, that was a potential concern. I have a colleague who many of you may know that prior to coming online and working with NIOP, I actually had about 12 different associations that I worked for. But when we were fortunate enough to get NIOP and prior to COVID, we looked at restructuring my company to where I did not have as many employees and I did not have as many associations, so that we could handle the work ourselves. That'd be me and Scott, that is. So most of my clients that I had in my past all went to one of my previous employees, and she and I are in constant contact. When I say that, we talk at least 2 or 3 times a month. And we have already talked about it. Should I ever come down with an illness or a kidney stone, Lord forbid, or COVID, would she and her staff be able, because she staffed up when I staffed down. So she is in the wings should I ever need her. And certainly she has her eye on the ball for at the future point that maybe I ever get to think about retiring, which is not about 20 years from now. But anyway, she has her eyes on this, and she is also kept kind of up to speed as far as what's going on. We meet quarterly face to face, and not necessarily to go over anything at great detail, but to talk about, what our schedules look like, what her schedules looks like. So we actually have a little bit of a plan should something happen. And again, she has a larger team, so it wouldn't just be one person there. So the hope and the likelihood is that she would have people, if not including herself. And she's worked with some of our volunteers in the past too. So there's a comfort level for me that should something horrible like that come up that I can't come, I at least do have a plan B and somebody who's familiar with our industry somewhat and with some of our volunteers, and is, kept up at least quarterly on what the plans are, what the dates are, how things are looking.
Thanks, Lee.
Sure. Anybody else? So I have a question for you guys, and you can chew on it and let us know individually, or you can respond right here. But I know that when I first came on board, I think John had just done one of these. Do we do this every year? Do we do it only with the new board members each year? We had gotten away from it for a few years. So that's why we have so many people participating today. But in the future, could the recorded session work? Would you like to have us do this? Any kind of feedback on what this should look like going forward? And again, maybe it's not an answer you'll have today, but I think I would be interested to know so that for planning next year, we know where to plug it in or how.
Lee, Todd here. I'm part of some different like city like commission type stuff, and I know we do an annual one. I mean, I think it's good to do it annually. It's a good refresher for anybody, and it's we're not talking a half a day or day commitment here. We're talking an hour. I think it's at worst, it's a good refresher course.
I appreciate that, Todd.
I'm going to agree with Todd. And Lee, can you cut that out of the recording? I don't really want that on record.
Hey, Lee, Scott here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I agree with Todd as well. But one thing that might be a good idea is for prospective board members, people who are trying to decide whether they want to join the board or not once invited, something like this slide presentation might be good for them to at least have the ability to review it so they sort of know what their requirements and expectations are before actually joining the board.
Thank you for that. Good feedback. John, we can work on it if it's this version or some other version of it. Yeah. Well, anything else?
This is Eric. I agree with if everyone. Although I would say maybe it's better to start it at the beginning of the year as a refresher before ever the meetings take place, just so everybody has their eye on the ball as we get together.
Okay, timing. Thank you. Timing's good. Anything else? If not, I'd love to stay on track with Mr. Owen. Brian.
Oh, no, that's somebody was coming in my office. I was waving them off.
Sorry.
Well, Brian, I was just saying, just in keeping with your pace so far, we've been able to stay on schedule or ahead of schedule. So if we don't have any other questions, Mr. President, it's really back to you.
All right, then I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Thanks, everyone, for
All
your
those
time.
in favor say aye.
Aye.
Carries, we're adjourned. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.